Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Before we take up today's analysis, we would like to inform you that from today we shall be launching a dedicated portal to help improve your answer writing skills. The link for this portal shall be shared in the description box below. And for the mains practice questions that we provide every day in the Hindu analysis, you can write and post your answers on this portal where you will be able to see the answers of other students as well, which will help you in carrying out a peer review amongst yourselves. This initiative will be particularly useful for beginners as you'll get to learn by looking at the answers of other students, because one of the best ways to improve answer writing skills is by reviewing and learning from the answers of others. So we hope you will make full use of this initiative, and if you make it a daily habit of writing answers and reviewing a few answers of your peers, I can guarantee that within a few months, your answer writing skills will considerably improve. So the link for the same shall be shared in the description box below. So please register yourselves and make use of this initiative. So with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from page number 1 of the Delhi edition. This article refers to the violent clashes that have broken out between Assam and Mizoram over their border dispute. These border tensions have persisted since many years between Assam and Mizoram, but since last year, it has been increasingly taking a violent turn. Yesterday, following provocations by both the sides, large-scale violence broke out along the disputed border, and along with several civilians and policemen being injured on both the sides, unfortunately 6 policemen from the Assam police have lost their lives. In these violent clashes, even the SP of Kachar district, which shares a border with Mizoram, has been seriously injured, while Mr. Vaibhav Nimbalkar Chandrakant, who is an IPS officer of the 2009 batch, was on the ground trying to contain the situation that had exploded. Following these violent clashes, the Union Home Minister has spoken to the chief ministers of both the states to scale down the tensions and the violence, as both internal security and center-state relations fall under the mandate of the Union Home Ministry. In fact, in order to resolve this long-standing border dispute, just a couple of days ago, Union Minister Amit Shah had held a meeting with the chief ministers of all the northeastern states at Shillong, and during this meeting, involving the center and the concerned states, the Union Home Minister had promised both the chief ministers to quickly resolve this issue peacefully by working out a quick and fair solution. But just a couple of days after this meeting, large-scale violence has broken out along the disputed sides, after reportedly the police and the civilians on both the sides created a provocation. So in this context, let's understand the Assam-Mizoram border dispute in complete detail by focusing on the root cause and its background. See, in the northeast of India, there are several such interstate boundary disputes. The interstate boundary disputes, they're not just limited to Assam and Mizoram, but there are similar interstate boundary disputes between Assam and other states as well. For example, the border dispute between Assam and Nagaland. The prolonged existence of these interstate boundary disputes is a direct result of the complex history and complex geography of the northeast of India. As you all know, the northeast of India has a very unique geography and demography, and it is home to several indigenous tribes. So drawing up administrative divisions in the region has always been a complex task as a result of intertribal conflicts. And if you were to trace the history of these boundary disputes, they all date back to the blunders that were committed by the colonial government. The then British government in India, which was deeply interested in the resources of the Northeast, did not hesitate to violate the rights of the tribal communities. And in order to protect its commercial interests, it drew up haphazard boundaries, sometimes without even consulting the local tribes. So these colonial blunders, accompanied with post-independence reorganization of the Northeast, has directly contributed to several interstate boundary disputes in the region. You might be aware that when India became independent, Assam was a very large state which actually included many of the current states of the Northeast. In fact, it was only later that when India was reorganized, that many new states and union territories were carved out of Assam, and later many of these union territories were also given complete statehood. For example, Nagaland was carved out of Assam in 1963 and it was granted complete statehood. Then in 1972, during a major reorganization, several new union territories were carved out of Assam, including Arunachal Pradesh, formerly known as the Northeast Frontier Agency, Meghalaya, Mizoram, etc. Later, all these union territories were granted statehood as well. But the drawing up of these administrative boundaries based on colonial demarcations led to several unresolved disputes, which continues to persist even today. So just like we are witnessing a border dispute between Assam and Mizoram, similar disputes and violent clashes have been seen with regard to Assam and Nagaland as well. See, in the case of Mizoram, the native tribe are the Mizos, who inhabit the Lushai Hills located over here. See, this map is showing you the 165-kilometer border between Assam and Mizoram that exists over here. There are three districts present on both the sides. We have Karimganj, Hailakandi and Kachar in Assam, and we have Aizwal, Kolasib and Mamet in Mizoram. So this boundary that has been drawn up between Assam and Mizoram essentially delineates the Kachar Plains, which is part of the Barak River Valley in Assam, from the Lushai Hills, which is home to the Mizo tribe. But the demarcation of this boundary line has always been disputed between Assam and Mizoram. That's because, due to colonial blunders, there are two different demarcations that exist. One of the first demarcations dates back to the 1875 notification, which was based upon the Bengal Eastern Frontier Regulation Act of 1873. If you remember, in previous classes, we have discussed this legislation, which led to the introduction of ILP or Inner Line Permit System in the Northeast region. The British introduced the ILP system through the Bengal Eastern Frontier Regulation Act in order to protect their commercial interests by prohibiting Indians from other parts of the country from entering these ILP areas. Based on this, the British further held consultations with the Mizo tribes and their leaders who inhabited the Lushai Hills, and following this consultation, they worked out a demarcation line which was notified in 1875. This demarcation line is currently acceptable to Mizoram because this negotiation involved the leaders of the Mizo tribe, and this was the only time when the Mizos were consulted while drawing the boundaries that would delineate and demarcate the Lushai Hills. Then later, the British came out with another notification in 1933, which provided for a new alignment for the boundary. But while drawing this boundary, the British did not consult the Mizos. Without holding any negotiations with the Mizo tribe leaders, a new realigned boundary was drawn up, which was later accepted by the Assam government, but it has always been rejected by the Mizos. Even when the Mizo insurgency was raging, led by the Mizo National Front, throughout the period between 1960s and 1990s, that is until the Mizo insurgency was brought to an end, even the insurgents were strictly opposed to this boundary, which was based upon the 1933 notification. Today, the stand of the government of Mizoram is that the boundary between Assam and Mizoram should be based upon the 1875 notification, which involved consultation with Mizo leaders. They outright reject the boundaries drawn on the basis of the 1933 notification, whereas this notification is accepted by the government of Assam. So along the border areas that stretch along these districts, there are several disputed locations as a result of this different perception of the border. So on both the sides, their claims stretch across a few kilometers into the territory of the other state, and this dispute has existed since several years. So in order to maintain status quo and ensure that this dispute does not turn violent, an agreement had also been signed between Assam and Mizoram. But unfortunately, every now and then, both the sides, they keep pushing their territorial claims, largely for political reasons. And there are several instances where both the sides have taken up unauthorized construction in areas claimed by the other, following which officials of the other side will come and demolish these structures built by the other side. Especially since last year, these tensions have mounted following unauthorized construction carried out by few civilians from Mizoram, who reportedly have the backing of the state government the state police, and as well as few local militants. So this aggressive push by Mizoram, involving both officials and civilians, is countered by Assam as well, where the local civilians and local officials aggressively try to counter any incursions into their territory, and they even end up demolishing several structures built by the other side. So these tensions were simmering from last year, and minor clashes had taken place a few months ago. But yesterday, following a major provocation, large scale violent clashes have been reported, which has left several people and officials injured, along with the unfortunate death of 6 policemen from Assam Police during their line of duty. So, this is clearly a subject to be dealt under center state relations, as it involves an interstate dispute. And the only way to work out the dispute is for the center to step in and work out an amicable, fair solution to both the states. Violence can never be a way to resolve interstate boundary disputes. And within the provisions of the Constitution of India, these disputed boundary lines will have to be finalized once for all. For this, both the state governments will have to tone down their rhetoric and bring down the tensions. And at any cost, they need to maintain peace and tranquility along the border areas. Because such violent clashes and instability is never conducive for the region, which has been hit by long periods of insurgency and violence. Any further escalation could feed such insurgent tendencies, and hence, this issue even has the potential to turn into an internal security threat for India and these states. So, under the ambit of the Indian Constitution, we have Article 3, which empowers the Parliament to redraw state boundaries. And through talks and consultations between the two states, a fair and equitable solution has to be worked out, and the centre will have to play a lead role over here. The centre has already deployed a neutral force in the border areas, and for the time being, the CRPF has been given the task to maintain stability along these borders. So now the time has come for all the stakeholders to sit together and carve out a solution within the terms of the Constitution. Now let's take up a column from page number 6 related to the topic of Indian diaspora. In this column, the writer evaluates the Immigration Bill 2021 that has been brought out by the Ministry of External Affairs, which is likely to be tabled in the ongoing monsoon session. The Immigration Bill was placed in the public domain by the External Affairs Ministry for receiving inputs and feedback from the public, and it seeks to replace the Immigration Act of 1983. As the name itself suggests, this bill would be concerned about the rights and well-being of immigrants from India, that is, those who travel out of India to work and settle in foreign countries. So every year, lakhs of Indian migrant workers seek out employment opportunities abroad, and through this process of immigration, millions of Indians have found employment in foreign countries, and they continue to work and reside in those countries. Only a small percentage of these immigrant workers are highly educated and highly qualified, and they often seek out white-collar jobs, especially in the developed Western countries. But a majority of the immigrant workers from India, they do not possess high degrees, they are often semi-skilled or unskilled, and millions of them, they take up blue-collar jobs in developing and underdeveloped nations around the world, particularly in the West Asia region, followed by Southeast Asia and Africa. These Indian immigrant workers, they form a core part of the Indian diaspora abroad, and they play a key role in Indian foreign policy. They not only act as India's cultural ambassadors and help in projecting India's soft power, but they also send back precious remittances to their families back home in India, which is critical for India for bridging its current account deficit. So the Indian government would be obligated to protect the rights of these workers and take care of their well-being, because particularly the blue-collar workers from India, they face a variety of threats and concerns while being employed in foreign countries. Most of those who take up these blue-collar jobs, especially in the Gulf and in Southeast Asia and Africa, they often come from poor rural families, and they are desperately looking for better livelihood opportunities in order to sustain their families back home in India. Considering that they don't possess high degrees, and since they are not from affluent families, and since a large majority of them are semi-skilled or unskilled, They are not completely aware of the employment opportunities that exist abroad, but they are driven by the necessity to find a job abroad in order to sustain their families. And this pushes them into the hands of several agents, middlemen, and brokers. See, most of these blue collar workers from India, they come from states such as Kerala, Bihar, Andhra Pradesh, etc. West Asia is said to have the highest population of Indian diaspora, and reportedly close to 10 million Indians reside and work in the Gulf countries. Then there are few million Indians residing and working in Southeast Asian countries, followed by lakhs of Indians residing and working in African countries. Most of these blue collar workers, when they initially seek out employment opportunities in these countries, they are not aware of the legal and diplomatic issues that lie ahead, and many of them will not even possess a basic passport or the visas that are required. So, to arrange for these logistics, they often reach out to agents and middlemen who carry out recruitment on behalf of employers in those countries. So, in many cases, the Indian workers who are seeking out employment opportunities with these foreign employers, they are harassed, exploited, abused, and even duped by the middlemen in several instances, thereby making this migrant worker population very vulnerable. So that is the reason why we need an immigration law to help protect the rights and dignity of Indian workers, along with addressing all the threats and concerns that they face in order to ensure their overall well being. This is an obligation on the Government of India and the Ministry of External Affairs because they are not only Indian citizens, but more importantly, they are also contributing to India's national power and India's foreign policy. So this new bill which has been brought out by the External Affairs Ministry, it seeks to replace the old and outdated Emigration Act of 1983, and it contains a few key provisions. The bill proposes to establish a new immigration policy division within the MEA to provide exclusive focus and attention to immigration related issues. Then, more importantly, the bill seeks to put in place a mechanism for recruitment of these workers, and it puts in place a hiring process which has to be followed by the government certified agents. Only those agents, be it individuals or companies, only those who have been certified by the government can carry out this hiring process for recruiting Indian workers for these foreign employers. The objective of the bill is to regulate the activities of these agents and middlemen so that the rights of the Indian workers is protected. It also places a set of obligations on the agents, and it would be their responsibility to check whether all the documents are in place and whether the safety and the well-being of the Indian workers would be protected by the foreign employer. Because see, we have come across several instances, especially in West Asia, where Indian workers are exploited and abused. There are many cases where the agents and the middlemen, they overcharge their service fees and they extract money from the poor workers in the name of finding employment for them in foreign countries. The Indian workers who are desperate to find these jobs, they end up borrowing a debt, usually from money lenders, in order to pay these high service fees, which is being charged by the agents and the middlemen. So these fees that are charged, they are not currently regulated. Hence, the government is placing a set of obligations and responsibilities on the middlemen. The hiring process would be regulated as per the provisions of the law, and it is designed to put a cap on the recruitment charges. Then Indian workers also face many other challenges where they are often duped or deceived by the agents or by the employers after they land in foreign countries. And in many cases, they even confiscate their passports after they land, thereby effectively confining them to their place of work. There are several instances where Indian workers are not paid proper wages as promised, and they are often forced to live in very poor living conditions because the employer will fail to provide them basic social security, and they will have to struggle even for their basic needs such as food and shelter. There have been many instances where Indian workers do not receive any insurance or medical benefits, and they are often forced to live in cramped up conditions, and in many cases, they have even been forced to starve, thereby leading to the violation of their human rights and dignity. They often face discrimination and ill treatment at the hands of their foreign employers. And there have been many cases where they have been abused, both physically, emotionally, and as well as sexually. And eventually, this turns into a form of a forced labor. The blame for this largely rests with the middlemen and the agents who are aware of these conditions, and yet they push Indian workers into these harsh conditions. And hence, the bill is seeking to hold these brokers and middlemen completely accountable. The government is also planning to set up the required help desks and welfare committees, both in India and as well as in the concerned countries, that is through our embassies and consulates, in order to provide better immigration services to Indian workers. The External Affairs Ministry has claimed that the provisions of the bill have been designed by keeping in mind the interests of the Indian workers. But however, despite some of these good provisions, the writer points out that this bill has several major drawbacks. First and foremost, the bill does not consider the human rights perspective. The bill proposed by the ministry has no human rights framework, and it fails to recognize the rights and dignity of Indian workers, and it does not even acknowledge the contributions being made by Indian workers abroad. In contrast, if you compare this bill with a similar act which was recently enacted by Philippines, you will notice that Philippines has acknowledged the immense contribution that its nationals are making to its economy and to its foreign policy, and it goes on to recognize their rights and dignity. But ironically, the bill proposed by India doesn't make any mention of the rights of the workers and their dignity, and doesn't even acknowledge the immense contribution being made by Indian workers. The next biggest drawback of the bill is that it places the burden of paying these recruitment charges on the workers. Basically, the agents and the middlemen, they are allowed to charge the workers for all the recruitment services that they are providing. That is with regard to their passports, their visa, their air travel, their initial accommodation. Everything has to be paid for by the workers themselves. This is in direct contradiction of international standards that have been laid down by the ILO, or the International Labour Organization. Through its guidelines and through its conventions, such as Convention number 181, the ILO has clearly specified that such recruitment and hiring charges will have to be entirely borne by the employer, not by the workers. The foreign employer needs to pay for these charges for the middlemen and the agents, and the workers who are desperately seeking employment, they shouldn't be charged for this. But unfortunately, the proposed law in India does the exact opposite of this. See, the reason why the employers are made to take this burden is because if poor workers who are seeking blue collar jobs, if they are placed under this burden, that is the burden of payment of these recruitment hiring charges, which will run into a few lakh rupees, then of course these workers from poor rural families, they won't be able to afford the fees. And as they're desperately looking for jobs and better livelihood, they end up borrowing loans, usually at very high interest rates from money lenders, and they fall into a debt burden. So even before they find a job and travel to a foreign country, they are already under a major debt burden, and this makes them vulnerable to be exploited by the agents, by the middlemen, and of course by the foreign employer. Collusion between these agents and foreign employers leads to the further exploitation of Indian workers who are under a debt burden. Now, the poor Indian workers would be under even more pressure to pay back the loans, and out of sheer desperation, they would be forced by the agents and even by the employers to take up exploitative jobs with very poor wages and poor living conditions. Then, the third point of criticism against the bill is that it shockingly includes a provision to punish the workers if they violate the terms of the law. It basically allows the Indian government and the Indian officials to revoke the passports of Indian workers and even place penalties on them if they are found to be violating any of the provisions of the Emigration Act. Now, this again seems to be unfair because in many cases the workers are not aware of all the legal and diplomatic implications. Then finally, the bill fails to take into account the gender perspective or the gender dimension. Because amongst the migrant workers who go abroad, it is the women who are the most vulnerable, because there have been several instances where women workers have been subjected to greater abuse, including physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. And there are several instances where agents have duped women and have pushed them into prostitution and trafficking, thereby leading to gross violation of their rights. So the gender dimension of migrant labor is not taken into account at all in the bill, and this again happens to be a major shortcoming. Next, on page number 6, we have an editorial which evaluates the environmental and ecological factors that are responsible for a spate of disasters in the Himalayan states. Just yesterday, we spoke about the tragic landslide in Himachal Pradesh, which has highlighted the fragile ecology and ecosystem of the Himalayan states. Studies have time and again shown that increasing occurrence of disasters such as cloudbursts, flash floods, and landslides, especially in hilly terrain areas such as the Himalayan states, is a direct result of both climate change and global warming, and as well as a result of unplanned, unregulated development. In states such as Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and the other Himalayan states, highly exploitative tourism has taken over, which has directly contributed to widespread destruction of the sensitive ecology and environment of these Himalayan states. Even in highly hazard-prone areas, a lot of construction activity is taken up, including developmental activities, which makes the region more vulnerable to the impact of these disasters. Then the other major factor is the massive hydropower projects that are being planned in the region. Hydropower is often seen as a clean and renewable form of energy as compared to fossil fuels. But however, large hydropower projects, especially in hilly terrains and in the sensitive ecology of the Himalayan region, can be very destructive to the sensitive environment. Such large-scale projects results in land use changes, which may not be sustainable as far as its environmental impact is concerned. The large-scale construction activity, along with changes to the course of the river, can end up permanently disrupting the sensitive ecological balance that exists in the Himalayan region. Now add to this the problems created by climate change and global warming. Rising global temperatures are melting the Himalayan glaciers, and it is directly contributing to increasing frequency and strength of extreme weather events such as cloudbursts, flash floods, etc. The widespread destruction of the forest cover on the hilly terrain has weakened the top layer of the soil, directly contributing to landslides. So the editorial strikes a note of caution against such unplanned, unregulated development and calls upon the government to pay heed to the science behind climate change. Because scientific risk assessment is making it very clear that extreme weather events are going to increase in the coming years around the world, and regions with a sensitive ecology and regions which are already hazard prone and vulnerable, they will witness higher frequency of disasters, which is going to result in widespread damage to life and property in the region. The editorial says that it may still not be too late to change course and focus more on sustainable development in order to help restore this ecological balance. Next, on page number 7 and as well as on page number 9, we have a couple of articles related to the ongoing developments in Afghanistan. But in previous classes, we have repeatedly covered these topics, including India's engagement with the Taliban and India's concerns about Pakistan's role in Afghanistan, and as well as India's options in Afghanistan. So I would request you to go through these articles once, and for further clarification, you can go back and revisit the Hindu analysis of the last few weeks, where we have covered this topic repeatedly in great detail. So now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: explain the background to the Assam-Mizoram border dispute in detail. The second question: critically analyze the Immigration Bill 2021. Will it be sufficient to protect Indian workers abroad? Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers on the new answer writing portal that we are launching today, and the link for the same will be shared in the description box below. So with this, let's conclude our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.